In the aftermath of September 11, 2001, the United States embarked on what would become one of the most controversial chapters in its history. The attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon killed nearly 3,000 people and shocked the American nation. In response, the U.S. government launched what it called the War on Terror, a global campaign against terrorist organizations and the nations that harbored them. Afghanistan, which was controlled by the Taliban and harbored al-Qaeda, became the first major target of this war. But beneath the publicly announced military operations in Afghanistan, a secret war was being conducted by the Central Intelligence Agency. This secret war involved the establishment of hidden prisons, the capture and detention of thousands of people, and the systematic torture of detainees. These prisons existed in a legal and moral gray zone, beyond the reach of international law, beyond congressional oversight, and beyond public knowledge. What happened inside these prisons remains one of the darkest chapters in recent American history. The story of the CIA's secret prisons in Afghanistan is a story of institutional failure, moral compromise, and the corrosive effects of unchecked power. It is a story about how a democratic nation, in response to a genuine security threat, abandoned its founding principles and embraced practices that are universally recognized as torture and crimes against humanity. It is a story about how this happened not through explicit policy, but through a gradual erosion of legal and moral restraints. It is a story about how thousands of people, many of whom had nothing to do with terrorism, were captured, tortured, and disappeared into a system designed to be hidden from public view. To understand the CIA's secret prisons in Afghanistan, we must understand the context in which they were established. We must understand the decisions made in the aftermath of 9/11 that made torture possible. We must understand how the CIA justified its actions. We must understand what happened inside these prisons. And we must understand the consequences of these actions for the people detained, for Afghanistan, for America, and for the world. The story of the CIA's secret detention program begins with the authorization of enhanced interrogation techniques in the aftermath of 9/11. In the weeks and months after the attacks, senior U.S. government officials became convinced that traditional interrogation methods were insufficient for dealing with terrorism suspects. They believed that harsh interrogation techniques were necessary to extract information that could prevent future terrorist attacks. This belief was not universally held. Many experienced interrogators, including those in the military and the FBI, argued that harsh interrogation techniques were ineffective and counterproductive. They argued that rapport-based interrogation methods were more effective at obtaining accurate information. They argued that harsh interrogation would violate international law. But their voices were marginalized in the post-9/11 environment, where security concerns overwhelmed other considerations. The decision to authorize harsh interrogation techniques was made at the highest levels of government. President George W. Bush authorized the use of these techniques. Vice President Dick Cheney was a strong advocate for harsh interrogation. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld approved harsh interrogation techniques for use in military detention facilities. The CIA, which had previously relied on less brutal methods, began to develop an interrogation program based on harsh techniques. The CIA sought legal justification for these techniques. The Justice Department, under the leadership of Attorney General John Ashcroft and Assistant Attorney General Bybee, provided what became known as the torture memos. These memos argued that harsh interrogation techniques did not constitute torture as defined by law. They provided legal cover for practices that most of the world considered torture. The memos defined torture so narrowly that almost any technique could be justified. They argued that techniques causing severe physical or mental pain were not torture unless they rose to the level of causing organ failure or death. Under this legal framework, the CIA developed and implemented an interrogation program using a range of harsh techniques. These techniques included waterboarding, simulating drowning by pouring water over the face of a restrained detainee; sleep deprivation, keeping detainees awake for extended periods; confinement, keeping detainees in small dark spaces; stress positions, forcing detainees to remain in painful positions for extended periods; sensory deprivation, keeping detainees in darkness and silence; temperature manipulation, subjecting detainees to extreme cold or heat; physical abuse, striking detainees, sometimes with specific implements; threats, threatening detainees with death, harm to family members, or transfer to other countries; isolation, keeping detainees completely isolated from other people. These techniques were applied systematically and repeatedly. Detainees were subjected to multiple techniques in combination. Interrogation sessions could last for hours or days. The goal was to break down detainees' resistance and force them to provide information. The CIA's detention program operated through a network of secret prisons spread across multiple countries. While some detainees were held in facilities in foreign countries like Poland, Romania, and Thailand, Afghanistan hosted some of the most notorious CIA detention facilities. These facilities became known by various names: the Salt Pit, the Cobalt Eagle Base, and others. They existed in a legal gray zone, hidden from public view, beyond the reach of international inspectors, and beyond oversight by Congress or the courts. The Salt Pit was one of the earliest CIA detention facilities in Afghanistan. It was located in an abandoned Soviet-era facility near Kabul. Detainees held at the Salt Pit were subjected to harsh interrogation. The facility was known for extreme conditions. It was cold, dark, and isolated. Detainees were often held in underground cells. They were subjected to sleep deprivation and other harsh techniques. At least one detainee died at the Salt Pit, though the circumstances of his death were covered up and remains unclear. Cobalt was another major CIA detention facility in Afghanistan. It was located at a secret location in Kabul. Detainees at Cobalt were subjected to what the CIA called enhanced interrogation techniques. The facility was dark and foreboding. Detainees were held in cells described as resembling dungeons. They were subjected to sleep deprivation, stress positions, and other harsh techniques. Detainees at Cobalt reported being beaten, threatened, and subjected to extreme cold. One detainee reported being suspended from the ceiling by his arms. Another reported being kept awake for more than a week. Other CIA facilities in Afghanistan included Eagle Base and other unnamed locations. These facilities operated under conditions of extreme secrecy. The CIA maintained strict compartmentalization, ensuring that few people knew about the facilities or what was happening inside them. Even within the CIA, the detention program was known only to those with specific need to know. The detainees held in these facilities were captured through various means. Some were captured by U.S. military forces and transferred to CIA custody. Some were captured by Afghan warlords and local militia groups paid by the CIA, then transferred to CIA custody. Some were arrested by Pakistan's intelligence service and handed over to the CIA. Many detainees had no clear connection to terrorism or Al-Qaeda. Some were simply people in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some were captured based on faulty intelligence. Some were captured as a result of bounties offered by local warlords seeking to settle scores. The capture process itself was often brutal. People were taken from their homes, sometimes in the middle of the night. They were blindfolded and shackled. They were beaten during transport. They were threatened. They were denied information about where they were being taken or why they were being detained. Many detainees had no idea why they had been captured. Many had no opportunity to contact family members or lawyers. They simply disappeared into the CIA detention system. Once inside CIA detention facilities, detainees were subjected to interrogation designed to break their will and extract information. The interrogation program was based on interrogation methods that had been used by various authoritarian regimes. The CIA obtained copies of interrogation manuals from communist countries and studied how they conducted interrogation. The CIA then adapted these methods, combining them with harsh techniques to create what it called enhanced interrogation. The interrogation process followed a pattern. When a detainee first arrived at a facility, they would be subjected to what the CIA called conditioning. This involved harsh treatment designed to make the detainee aware of the interrogator's power and the futility of resistance. Detainees would be subjected to sleep deprivation, confinement in small spaces, stress positions, loud noise, and other harsh techniques. This conditioning could last for days or even weeks. After the conditioning phase, interrogators would begin formal interrogation sessions. Detainees would be questioned about their background, their knowledge of terrorism, and their connections to terrorist organizations. If detainees refused to answer, or if interrogators determined they were not providing truthful information, harsher techniques would be applied. One of the most notorious techniques was waterboarding. This technique simulates drowning. The detainee is placed on an inclined board with their head lower than their body. A cloth is placed over their face. Water is poured over the cloth, creating the sensation of drowning. The detainee cannot breathe. They experience panic and fear. The process is repeated multiple times. Some detainees were waterboarded more than 80 times during their detention. The purpose of waterboarding was to break down detainees' resistance and force them to provide information. But the technique is extraordinarily traumatic. Detainees subjected to waterboarding often broke psychologically. They confessed to things they had not done. They provided false information. They became incoherent or catatonic. Some detainees experienced permanent psychological damage. Sleep deprivation was another central technique in the CIA's interrogation program. Detainees would be kept awake for extended periods, sometimes for weeks. They would be subjected to loud noise, bright lights, or physical discomfort to prevent sleep. Sleep deprivation causes severe psychological effects. It impairs thinking and judgment. It causes hallucinations and paranoia. It can cause detainees to confess to things they did not do. It can cause permanent psychological damage. Stress positions were another technique. Detainees would be forced to maintain painful positions for extended periods, sometimes for hours at a time. They would be forced to stand with their arms stretched above their head, shackled to a ceiling. They would be forced into contorted positions. This caused severe pain and physical injury. Detainees sometimes lost consciousness or experienced permanent physical damage. Confinement in small spaces was another technique. Detainees would be placed in small, dark boxes or cells. Some boxes were so small that detainees could not fully stand or lie down. Detainees would be confined for hours or days. This caused severe psychological distress. Many detainees reported claustrophobia and panic in these confined spaces. Temperature manipulation was another technique. Detainees would be subjected to extreme cold or heat. In Afghanistan, detainees were sometimes kept in cold cells without blankets or adequate clothing. Some detainees experienced hypothermia. Others developed severe medical conditions from temperature extremes. Physical abuse was also used. Detainees were struck with fists or implements. Some detainees had their faces slammed into walls. Some had their heads held underwater until they nearly drowned. Some were beaten severely enough to cause lasting injury. The justification provided for these practices was that they were necessary to extract information that could prevent terrorist attacks. This was the argument made by CIA leadership, by senior government officials, and by supporters of the program. They argued that harsh interrogation was necessary because detainees would not provide information through other means. They argued that the information extracted through harsh interrogation had prevented terrorist attacks and saved lives. This justification was deeply flawed. First, there is no evidence that harsh interrogation is more effective at extracting accurate information than other methods. In fact, extensive research shows that harsh interrogation is counterproductive. Detainees subjected to harsh interrogation are more likely to provide false information. They will confess to anything to make the interrogation stop. They will make up information they think the interrogators want to hear. The information extracted through harsh interrogation is often unreliable. This unreliability was evident in the CIA's detention program. Detainees subjected to harsh interrogation made confessions that were demonstrably false. Some detainees confessed to involvement in terrorist plots they had nothing to do with. Some confessed to associations that did not exist. Some provided information that contradicted other evidence. Yet interrogators often accepted these false confessions as true because they fit pre-existing beliefs about who should be guilty. Second, the argument that harsh interrogation prevented terrorist attacks is not supported by evidence. The information extracted through harsh interrogation often did not lead to actionable intelligence. Some information led to dead ends or false leads. Some information was already known to intelligence agencies through other means. Some information was incorrect, leading investigators on wild goose chases. Third, the justification ignored the moral and legal problems with torture. Even if harsh interrogation were effective at extracting information, which it is not, it would still be morally wrong and legally prohibited. International law prohibits torture. The United Nations Convention Against Torture, which the United States signed and ratified, prohibits torture absolutely and unconditionally. There is no exception for security emergencies. There is no exception for preventing terrorist attacks. Torture is prohibited, period. Yet U.S. government officials defended torture as necessary and appropriate. They argued that the security threat justified extreme measures. They argued that harsh interrogation was not torture, based on narrow legal definitions that had been developed to justify the practice. They argued that other countries used similar techniques, so the United States should not be held to a higher standard. None of these arguments were persuasive to international observers, human rights organizations, or many legal experts. One of the most troubling aspects of the CIA's detention program was the treatment of detainees who were clearly innocent. Not all detainees held by the CIA were terrorists or had connections to terrorist organizations. Many were ordinary people who had the misfortune of being captured based on mistaken identity, faulty intelligence, or because of being fingered by local informants settling scores. One famous case involved an Afghan detainee who was held at the salt pit for months. The detainee had been captured based on faulty intelligence. He had no connection to terrorism. He was an innocent person who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. While held at the salt pit, this detainee was subjected to harsh interrogation. He was kept in an underground cell. He was subjected to cold and sleep deprivation. He was beaten. He eventually died in CIA custody under circumstances that were never fully explained. An autopsy was never conducted. The CIA claimed the death was from natural causes, but the circumstances remain suspicious. Another case involved a detainee who was held for years based on mistaken identity. The detainee's name was similar to the name of a suspected terrorist. Based on this similarity, he was captured and held by the CIA. While held in CIA custody, he was subjected to harsh interrogation. Years later, after extensive investigation, it became clear that he was innocent. He had been detained by mistake. He was eventually released, but only after years of torture and detention. The experience had destroyed his health and his life. These cases were not isolated. Many detainees held by the CIA were later determined to be innocent. Some were released after their innocence was established. Others remained in detention for years despite the absence of credible evidence against them. Still others were released, but their cases were never thoroughly investigated. The existence of these innocent detainees in the CIA's detention system reveals a fundamental problem. The detention program operated without meaningful judicial oversight or due process. Detainees had no opportunity to challenge their detention. They had no access to lawyers. They had no way to prove their innocence. Once detained, they were trapped in the system, subject to interrogation and harsh treatment with no clear path to release. The psychological impact of the CIA's detention program on detainees was severe and often permanent. Detainees subjected to harsh interrogation experienced profound trauma. Many developed post-traumatic stress disorder. Many experienced depression and anxiety. Some experienced permanent psychological damage and were unable to function normally after their release. One detainee described the experience of waterboarding as feeling like he was dying. He said that after being waterboarded, he felt like his mind had been destroyed. Another detainee described being held in solitary confinement as causing him to lose his sense of time and reality. He said he hallucinated and nearly lost his mind. A third detainee described the experience of sleep deprivation as causing him to feel like he was going crazy. He said that after weeks without sleep, he could not distinguish between reality and dreams. The physical effects of torture were also severe. Many detainees experienced injuries from being beaten, from being held in stress positions, or from other harsh treatment. Some experienced broken bones, some experienced permanent nerve damage, some experienced organ damage, some experienced infections from unsanitary detention conditions. Many detainees also experienced what might be called moral injury, the psychological damage from being treated as less than human, from being subjected to cruelty and degradation, from losing all sense of dignity and humanity. Detainees were subjected to humiliation. Some were subjected to sexual abuse or threats of sexual abuse. Some were threatened with death or with harm to family members. Some were subjected to mock executions. The psychological impact of this degradation was severe and lasting. After their release from CIA detention, many detainees struggled to reintegrate into society. They had difficulty forming relationships. They experienced flashbacks and nightmares. Many could not work due to their psychological condition. Some turned to substance abuse to cope with their trauma. Some attempted suicide. The CIA's detention program had not just harmed detainees while they were in custody, it had harmed them for the rest of their lives. The CIA's detention program operated with minimal oversight and accountability. Senior CIA officials were aware of the harsh treatment of detainees. CIA Director George Tenet was briefed on the interrogation program. Senior CIA officers approved harsh interrogation techniques, yet there was little internal accountability. Officers who carried out harsh interrogation were not punished. In fact, some were promoted. Those who raised concerns about the program were often marginalized or transferred. Congress was largely unaware of the extent of the CIA's detention program. While some members of Congress were briefed on the program, full details were often withheld. Briefings often omitted the most controversial aspects of the program. Members of Congress who received briefings often did not fully understand what was happening. Some members claimed they were misled about the extent of harsh interrogation. The courts were also kept in the dark about the program. Detainees had no access to courts. Legal cases challenging detention were often dismissed based on claims of national security. Federal courts were reluctant to interfere with national security decisions made by the executive branch. As a result, the courts provided no meaningful check on the detention program. International oversight was also absent. The International Committee of the Red Cross was eventually allowed limited access to some CIA detention facilities, but only after the program had been operating for years. Even when the ICRC was allowed access, their ability to investigate was limited. They could not interview all detainees. They could not investigate all allegations of abuse. They could not conduct surprise inspections. This lack of oversight created an environment where abuse flourished. Without meaningful oversight or accountability, there were few incentives for officers to follow the law or treat detainees humanely. Officers knew that harsh interrogation was being approved at the highest levels. Officers knew that legal cover was being provided by the Justice Department. Officers knew that congressional oversight was minimal. Officers knew that they were unlikely to face consequences for their actions. As a result, abuses accumulated. The question of who authorized torture in the CIA's detention program has been the subject of extensive investigation and debate. There is no question that the program was authorized at the highest levels of government. President Bush authorized the program. Vice President Cheney advocated for harsh interrogation. Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld approved harsh techniques. The Justice Department provided legal cover. But beyond these high-level authorizations, the question of specific individuals responsible for specific abuses has been more complicated. Within the CIA, multiple individuals bear responsibility for the detention program. CIA Director George Tenet oversaw the program. Senior CIA officers designed and implemented the program. Interrogators carried out the harsh treatment, but with rare exceptions, these individuals were never prosecuted or held accountable. The interrogators who carried out harsh interrogation often claimed they were following orders from higher-level officials. They claimed they were acting on the advice of the Justice Department. They claimed they were following CIA guidance. In some cases, these claims were accurate. Many interrogators were told by their superiors that the harsh techniques had been approved and were legal. Some interrogators raised concerns about the techniques but were ordered to continue. Some interrogators resigned or transferred rather than participate in the program. The failure to prosecute those responsible for torture is one of the most controversial aspects of the aftermath of the CIA's detention program. When the program was eventually disclosed to the public, there were calls for criminal prosecution of those responsible. But the Obama administration, which took office in 2009, ultimately decided not to prosecute CIA officers for their role in the program. President Obama stated that he wanted to look forward rather than backward and that prosecuting CIA officers would be too divisive. This decision meant that those who carried out or authorized torture faced no criminal consequences. The decision not to prosecute was controversial. Many legal experts argued that torture is a crime and those responsible should be prosecuted. Many victims' advocates argued that prosecution was necessary for justice and accountability, but the Obama administration's priority was on moving beyond the issue rather than pursuing accountability. This set a precedent that officials could engage in serious violations of law with minimal risk of prosecution, as long as there was political will to avoid prosecution. The international response to the CIA's detention program was one of strong condemnation. Human rights organizations around the world condemned the program as torture. International legal experts argued that the program violated international law. Foreign governments expressed concern about the program. But the United States, as a powerful nation with significant international influence, was largely able to resist international pressure to end the program or hold officials accountable. The European Union expressed concern about the CIA's secret prisons in Eastern European countries. Several European countries had hosted CIA detention facilities. When this became public, there were investigations and expressions of concern from European governments. But the investigations often did not result in concrete actions. Some countries that had hosted CIA facilities faced minimal consequences. The United Nations condemned the CIA's detention program as torture. The UN Torture Convention Committee found that the United States had violated international law through its detention and interrogation practices, but the UN has no power to enforce its findings. It could condemn, but it could not compel action. International humanitarian organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross documented abuses in CIA detention facilities. The ICRC stated that the CIA's practices constituted torture, but the ICRC's role is to provide humanitarian assistance and witness conditions, not to prosecute or hold governments accountable. International courts theoretically could have prosecuted U.S. officials for torture, but this was prevented by U.S. opposition. The International Criminal Court could theoretically have prosecuted, but the U.S. is not a member of the ICC. Other international courts lack jurisdiction over U.S. officials or are constrained by practical and political considerations. The relationship between the CIA's detention program and the military's detention program was complex and often overlapping. While the CIA operated secret prisons in Afghanistan and elsewhere, the military also operated detention facilities in Afghanistan and Iraq. Some military detention facilities were also used for harsh interrogation. Some detainees were transferred between CIA and military custody. Some detainees experienced both CIA interrogation and military interrogation. The military's detention program operated under somewhat more oversight than the CIA's program. Military detention facilities were subject to some inspections. Military personnel were subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Military detention was subject to more congressional oversight than CIA detention, but the military's detention program still involved abuses. Detainees in military custody also reported being subjected to harsh interrogation, sleep deprivation, and other abusive techniques. One of the most controversial military detention facilities was Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. Photographs from Abu Ghraib showing detainees being subjected to abuse shocked the world. The photographs showed detainees being humiliated and abused by military personnel. The scandal led to investigations and court-martials of some military personnel. But investigations of the military's detention program often found that abuses were more widespread than initially acknowledged. The relationship between CIA and military detention created opportunities for what became known as rendition, the transfer of detainees from one custody to another. Detainees were sometimes transferred from military custody to CIA custody or vice versa. Some detainees were transferred to the custody of other countries' intelligence services. These transfers sometimes occurred to move detainees to more harsh detention conditions. In some cases, detainees were rendered to countries known to torture, effectively outsourcing torture to countries with fewer legal restraints. One particularly controversial aspect of the CIA's detention program was the use of contractors and private companies. The CIA outsourced aspects of the detention program to private contractors. These contractors designed interrogation techniques, trained interrogators, and in some cases carried out interrogation. The use of contractors created additional layers of distance between senior government officials and those carrying out interrogation. It also created incentives for contractors to recommend harsh interrogation to justify their involvement and continued contracts. Two contractors in particular, James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, became central figures in the CIA's interrogation program. Mitchell and Jessen designed the enhanced interrogation techniques used by the CIA. They trained CIA interrogators in harsh interrogation methods. In some cases, they personally carried out interrogation. Mitchell and Jessen were paid millions of dollars for their role in the program. Mitchell and Jessen's background was in military survival training. They had worked with the military to teach survival techniques to personnel who might be captured and tortured by adversaries. They had studied how torture was conducted by communist regimes. They developed techniques to help American military personnel resist torture. But when contracted by the CIA, they essentially adapted these torture resistance training techniques into actual torture techniques used against detainees. The use of contractors in the detention program was controversial because it created potential conflicts of interest. Contractors profited from the continuation and expansion of the program. Contractors had incentives to recommend harsh interrogation to justify their continued involvement. When the program came under scrutiny, contractors had incentives to defend the program rather than acknowledge problems. The role of the Justice Department in providing legal cover for torture cannot be understated. The Justice Department, under Attorney General John Ashcroft and Assistant Attorney General Bybee, wrote legal opinions that effectively authorized torture. These opinions define torture so narrowly that almost any harsh interrogation technique could be justified. The most notorious of these legal opinions became known as the Bybee memo. Written by Bybee in August 2002, this memo provided legal analysis arguing that harsh interrogation techniques did not constitute torture as defined by law. The memo defined torture as causing severe physical or mental pain, equivalent to pain from organ failure, impairment of bodily function, or even death. Under this definition, techniques like waterboarding, stress positions, and sleep deprivation did not constitute torture because they did not cause organ failure or death. This definition of torture was radically different from international definitions. International law considers torture to include any intentional infliction of severe pain or suffering for purposes of obtaining information. By international standards, waterboarding clearly constitutes torture. But under the legal definitions provided by the Justice Department, waterboarding could be justified. The Bybee memo also addressed specific interrogation techniques, concluding that each could be legally used. The memo analyzed waterboarding and concluded it could be used. It analyzed stress positions and concluded they could be used. It analyzed sleep deprivation and concluded it could be used. For each technique, the memo provided legal reasoning arguing that the technique did not constitute torture. The Bybee memo was based on flawed legal reasoning and misapplied precedent. The memo relied on a narrow definition of torture that had been rejected by international courts and human rights organizations. The memo ignored or minimized the relevant international law obligations of the United States. The memo provided legal cover for practices that most legal experts considered torture. Later, the Justice Department wrote additional legal opinions addressing specific interrogation techniques. These opinions provided further legal cover for harsh interrogation. When these memos were later released to the public, they shocked many people. The legal reasoning was widely condemned by legal experts as fundamentally flawed. The question of whether the CIA's detention program actually worked, whether it actually prevented terrorist attacks or produced useful intelligence, remains controversial. CIA officials and defenders of the program argue that harsh interrogation produced valuable intelligence that prevented terrorist attacks. Critics argue that the program produced little useful intelligence and that most useful intelligence came from other sources. The debate over the effectiveness of the program was addressed in an extensive investigation by the Senate Intelligence Committee, which released its findings in 2014. The Senate investigation found that the CIA's detention program produced little useful intelligence that could not have been obtained through other means. The investigation found that detainees subjected to harsh interrogation often provided false information. The investigation found that the CIA had misrepresented the effectiveness of the program to senior government officials and to Congress. The Senate investigation was highly controversial. CIA officials disputed many of the investigation's findings. They argued that the investigation was biased and did not fully appreciate the value of the intelligence produced. They argued that the program had prevented terrorist attacks, but the investigation's findings were backed by extensive documentation and seemed credible to many observers. What the investigation made clear was that even if the program had been effective at producing intelligence, it would still have been torture and would still have been illegal. But the investigation's finding that the program was not even effective undermined one of the primary justifications for the program, that harsh interrogation was necessary to extract information. The CIA's detention program in Afghanistan was part of a broader secret detention network that spanned the globe. Detainees were held in facilities in multiple countries. Some countries that hosted CIA detention facilities were NATO allies, including Poland and Romania. Some were countries with less developed human rights records. The global nature of the secret detention network meant that the problem was not limited to Afghanistan, but was a broader global issue. In Afghanistan specifically, the CIA operated multiple detention facilities over many years. Some facilities were used primarily in the early years of the detention program after 9/11. Some facilities continued to operate for many years. The facilities were often located in remote areas where they could operate with minimal oversight. The conditions in these facilities were often harsh. Detainees were often subjected to abuse. The global nature of the detention program also created complications for international cooperation. Detainees from many different countries were held in these facilities. Many countries were concerned about their citizens being detained and tortured. Some countries protested and demanded the release of their citizens. But the U.S. government often resisted these demands, claiming that detainees could not be released because they posed security threats. Some countries cooperated with the U.S. detention program by allowing CIA facilities on their territory or by transferring detainees to CIA custody. But as the program became more controversial, some countries withdrew their support. Some demanded that CIA facilities be closed on their territory. Some demanded that detainees be released. The international pressure gradually limited the program's scope. The disclosure of the CIA's detention program to the public was a gradual process that occurred over years. Initially, the program was completely secret, but over time, information about the program leaked to the press. Journalists published articles about CIA secret prisons. Human rights organizations published reports about torture. Eventually, the program became so widely discussed that the government could no longer maintain complete secrecy. In 2005, media reports about the CIA's secret prisons shocked the public. The reports revealed that the CIA had established prisons in Eastern European countries. Journalists reported on the harsh conditions and interrogation techniques used. The report sparked outrage and controversy. But the CIA and government officials initially denied the reports or claimed that conditions were not as harsh as reported. In 2006, President Bush publicly acknowledged the detention program for the first time. He stated that the program had been important for national security. He claimed that detainees had provided valuable intelligence. He stated that detainees had been treated humanely and that interrogation techniques used were consistent with international law. But Bush acknowledged that some of the interrogation techniques had been controversial. In 2007, the Justice Department released some previously secret legal opinions justifying torture. This led to further controversy. Legal experts condemned the legal reasoning as flawed. Human rights organizations called for investigations and prosecutions, but the government maintained that the program had been legal and necessary. In 2009, the new Obama administration announced that it would close the detention program and would not use harsh interrogation techniques going forward. But Obama also stated that he did not want to look backward and prosecute those responsible for torture. This decision was controversial. Some argued that prosecution was necessary for justice and accountability. Others argued that prosecution would be too divisive. In 2014, the Senate Intelligence Committee released a major investigation into the CIA's detention program. The report, which became known as the Torture Report, documented the CIA's detention and interrogation program in extensive detail. The report found that the program involved torture, that the program was more extensive than previously disclosed, and that the program produced little valuable intelligence. The release of the report sparked renewed debate about the detention program and calls for accountability. The torture report was approximately 6,000 pages, though the government released only an executive summary of about 500 pages to the public. The classified version remained secret. The report was based on extensive documentation, including internal CIA records, memos, and emails. The report detailed specific detainees who had been tortured, specific interrogation techniques used, and specific abuses that had occurred. The report found that the CIA had misrepresented the effectiveness of the detention program to the White House, Congress, and the media. The CIA had claimed that harsh interrogation had produced valuable intelligence that prevented terrorist attacks. The report found that these claims were not accurate. The report found that most valuable intelligence came from other sources or from detainees before they were subjected to harsh interrogation. The report documented numerous abuses. It found that detainees had been subjected to waterboarding hundreds of times. It found that detainees had been subjected to sleep deprivation lasting weeks. It found that detainees had been subjected to other harsh interrogation techniques. It found that some detainees had been subjected to practices that went beyond what the CIA had authorized, including some detainees being severely beaten by interrogators. The release of the torture report led to further demands for accountability. Human rights organizations called for criminal prosecutions. Some countries suggested that U.S. officials could be prosecuted under international law. But the Obama administration maintained its position that it would not prosecute those responsible for torture. The report was released, but accountability did not follow. The long-term consequences of the CIA's detention program in Afghanistan have been profound. The program caused severe harm to thousands of detainees. Many detainees suffered permanent physical and psychological injury. Some detainees died in CIA custody under circumstances that remain unclear. Many detainees remained traumatized years after their release. The program also had consequences for Afghanistan as a country. The program created anger and resentment among the Afghan population. Afghans who had been detained and tortured by the CIA became opponents of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan. Family members of detained Afghans became opponents of the U.S. presence. The program contributed to anti-American sentiment and made Afghanistan less stable, not more stable. The program also had consequences for the United States. The disclosure of the CIA's detention and torture program damaged America's international reputation. America had long claimed to be a defender of human rights and the rule of law. The revelation that America was engaged in torture shocked many people around the world. The program contributed to anti-American sentiment globally. The program made it more difficult for the U.S. to criticize other countries for human rights violations, since America was clearly violating international human rights law. The program also had consequences within the U.S. government. The program corrupted the CIA's institutional culture. Officers involved in the program knew they had engaged in practices that were widely considered torture. This knowledge created psychological strain for some officers. The program also created divisions within the intelligence community, as some officers raised concerns about the program while others defended it. The question of accountability for torture committed by CIA officers remains unresolved. While a few military personnel were prosecuted for abuses in military detention facilities, no CIA officers were prosecuted for their role in the detention program. No government officials were prosecuted. The architects of the program, including those who authorized it and those who designed it, faced no criminal consequences. This lack of accountability stands in stark contrast to the accountability imposed on other nations for torture. When other countries have been accused of torture, the United States has often called for investigations and prosecutions. The U.S. has supported bringing cases to international courts. The U.S. has criticized countries that have engaged in torture or that have failed to prosecute those responsible. But when the U.S. itself engaged in torture, accountability was absent. The lack of accountability also stands in contrast to the precedent set after World War II. After Nazi Germany conducted systematic torture and abuse, the victorious powers conducted trials, the Nuremberg trials, to hold Nazi officials accountable for crimes against humanity. The principle established was that officials cannot escape accountability by claiming they were following orders. The principle was that torture and abuse are crimes, and those responsible must be prosecuted. The lack of accountability for CIA torture suggests a troubling double standard. Torture is prosecuted when other countries do it, but not when the U.S. does it. This creates the impression that the U.S. is not genuinely committed to the principle that torture is a crime. It creates the impression that the U.S. believes it is above international law. The question of whether the United States will engage in torture again in the future remains open. After the Obama administration ended the detention program and prohibited torture, it seemed that the U.S. had learned from its mistakes. But during the Trump administration, torture once again became a possibility. President Trump expressed support for waterboarding and other harsh interrogation techniques. Trump stated that he believed harsh interrogation was necessary and effective. Trump appointed officials who had been involved in or supported the detention program. While the Trump administration did not formally reauthorize the detention program or torture, Trump's statements and actions suggested that torture might be reconsidered if another major terrorist attack occurred. This created concern among human rights advocates that the painful lessons of the detention program might be forgotten. The question of whether torture will be used again is important because it reveals whether the U.S. has genuinely learned from past mistakes, or whether those mistakes could be repeated under different circumstances. If torture is used again, it would suggest that the U.S. has not fully come to terms with what happened and why it was wrong. It would suggest that the safeguards put in place to prevent torture are not sufficient to prevent it from happening again. The role of Congress in enabling or failing to prevent the CIA's detention program is also important to examine. Congress has oversight responsibility over the CIA and should have been aware of what the agency was doing. But Congress largely abdicated this responsibility. Some members of Congress were briefed on the program but received incomplete or misleading information. Some members of Congress raised concerns but were not heeded. Most members of Congress were simply not aware of the extent of the program. The failure of congressional oversight meant that the executive branch had essentially unchecked power to operate the detention program. With no meaningful congressional oversight, the executive could establish detention facilities, detain people, torture them, and dispose of the evidence with minimal risk of being stopped. After the detention program was disclosed and the torture report was released, Congress conducted investigations and held hearings. But these investigations occurred years after the program had operated. By then the damage had been done. Going forward, Congress has the opportunity to strengthen oversight mechanisms to prevent similar programs from operating in secret in the future. But whether Congress will actually take this responsibility seriously remains to be seen. The international legal status of the CIA's detention program is clear. It violated international law. The program violated the UN Convention Against Torture. The program violated international humanitarian law. The program violated customary international law prohibiting torture. These violations are not matters of legal dispute, they are universally acknowledged by international legal experts. The question of whether U.S. officials can be prosecuted for these violations under international law is more complicated. The International Criminal Court could theoretically prosecute U.S. officials for torture committed by the CIA. But the U.S. is not a member of the ICC and actively opposes the court's jurisdiction over U.S. citizens. Other international courts could theoretically prosecute, but they face practical and political obstacles. Some legal experts have argued that other countries could prosecute U.S. officials for torture committed on their territory or against their citizens. Some countries have investigated CIA detention and interrogation. But the U.S. has generally been able to protect its officials from prosecution through diplomatic pressure and political influence. The question of international accountability for CIA torture remains largely unresolved. While the program is clearly illegal under international law, those responsible for it have not faced prosecution in international courts. This represents a significant gap in international accountability and creates a troubling precedent. The question of what happened to detainees after they were released from CIA custody is also important to examine. Some detainees were released after years in detention. Others were transferred to military custody. Others were transferred to the custody of foreign intelligence services. Some detainees have never been accounted for. Many released detainees have provided accounts of their detention and torture. These accounts have corroborated the findings of the torture report. Released detainees have described being waterboarded. They have described being subjected to sleep deprivation. They have described being subjected to stress positions and other harsh techniques. They have described psychological trauma from their detention. Some released detainees have become advocates against torture. They have spoken publicly about their experiences. They have testified before Congress and international bodies. They have written books and given interviews. Their testimonies have provided invaluable documentation of what actually happened in CIA detention facilities. But many detainees were never released. Some disappeared into CIA custody and were never accounted for. Their fates remain unknown. This is particularly troubling because it suggests that some detainees may have died in CIA custody and their deaths were covered up. It also means that families of these detainees never received closure or answers about what happened to their loved ones. The role of the media in uncovering and reporting on the CIA's detention program has been important. Journalists investigated the program, interviewed detainees and their families, obtained government documents, and published their findings. These investigative reports eventually led to public awareness of the program. Early media reports about CIA secret prisons in Eastern Europe were particularly important in bringing public attention to the program. These reports shocked many people by revealing that the CIA was operating secret prisons in Allied countries. Further media investigations documented the harsh conditions in these prisons and the torture that occurred. But media coverage was often limited or delayed. For years after 9/11, the program operated in near-total secrecy. The media did not know about it or could not get access to information about it. Once leaks began occurring, media organizations faced decisions about whether to publish information about classified programs. Some media organizations, particularly those with close relationships with government officials, were reluctant to publish information that government officials asked them not to publish. Other media organizations went ahead and published despite government requests not to. The challenge for media organizations was balancing the public's right to know about government activities with legitimate security concerns. In some cases, the government argued that publishing information about the detention program could jeopardize national security. But in many cases, government requests not to publish information seemed designed more to protect government officials from public scrutiny than to protect legitimate security interests. The psychological mechanisms that enabled officers to torture detainees are worth examining. How did ordinary CIA officers come to participate in torture? How did they rationalize their actions? What psychological processes allowed them to overcome the normal moral restraints against harming others? One mechanism was what psychologists call gradual moral disengagement. Officers were not immediately asked to engage in extreme torture. Instead, they were gradually introduced to harsher and harsher techniques. An officer might first be asked to subject a detainee to sleep deprivation. After becoming comfortable with this technique, the officer might be asked to use stress positions. After becoming comfortable with these techniques, the officer might be asked to participate in waterboarding. This gradual escalation allowed officers to overcome their moral restraints bit by bit. Another mechanism was the authority of those giving orders. When a superior officer or government official authorized torture, this provided psychological permission to officers to engage in practices they might otherwise resist. Officers could tell themselves that they were following orders from higher authority. This displaced responsibility for the harsh treatment from individual officers to higher authorities who had authorized the program. Another mechanism was the dehumanization of detainees. Detainees were portrayed as dangerous terrorists who posed threats to American security. This portrayal made it easier for officers to justify harsh treatment. If detainees were not fully human, or if they were portrayed as fundamentally different and dangerous, then the normal restraints against harming human beings could be overcome. Another mechanism was the compartmentalization of knowledge. Officers involved in interrogation often did not know what was happening in other parts of the CIA. Officers who designed interrogation techniques often did not fully understand the consequences of those techniques. Officers who carried out interrogation were often not fully aware of what their actions were doing to detainees. This compartmentalization meant that the full horror of what was being done was not visible to any individual officer. The consequences of the CIA's detention program for the war in Afghanistan are also important to consider. The program was ostensibly designed to extract information that would help the U.S. defeat terrorism and achieve stability in Afghanistan, but there is little evidence that the program actually achieved these goals. By many measures, the situation in Afghanistan deteriorated over the years the detention program operated. The Taliban maintained strength or grew stronger. Al-Qaeda's leadership survived and continued operating. Civilian casualties increased. Afghanistan remained unstable. Many analysts argue that the detention program actually made things worse by creating anger and resentment among the Afghan population. If the goal was to win the hearts and minds of Afghans and to build support for a stable, democratic Afghanistan, torturing Afghans and detaining innocent people was certainly not an effective strategy. The program created enemies of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan. It contributed to the perception that the U.S. was an occupying power engaged in oppression, not a liberating force fighting terrorism. The question of what should happen going forward, how to prevent torture in the future, and how to hold those responsible for past torture accountable remains contested. There are several different perspectives on this question. One perspective is that there should be criminal prosecutions of those responsible for torture. From this perspective, torture is a crime, and those who authorized or carried out torture should be prosecuted. This perspective is supported by international law, which prohibits torture absolutely and provides for prosecution of those responsible. This perspective is also supported by the principle of accountability, which suggests that those who commit crimes should face consequences. Another perspective is that there should be a truth and reconciliation process rather than prosecutions. From this perspective, public disclosure of what happened is more important than criminal punishment. This perspective emphasizes understanding and accountability through truth-telling rather than through criminal prosecution. This perspective is often supported by those who want to move beyond the past and focus on the future. A third perspective is that there should be administrative or civil accountability rather than criminal prosecution. From this perspective, those responsible for torture might face disciplinary action from their employer, the CIA, loss of employment, loss of security clearances, or civil lawsuits seeking damages. This perspective seeks accountability without criminal prosecution. A fourth perspective is that there should be institutional reform to prevent torture in the future, with less emphasis on punishment for past actions. From this perspective, the focus should be on changing the institutions and systems that made torture possible, rather than on punishing individuals. This perspective emphasizes prevention going forward rather than accountability for the past. The role of medical professionals in the CIA's detention program is also worth examining. The CIA employed physicians and psychologists in its detention facilities. These medical professionals were supposed to ensure that torture did not cause permanent injury or death, but in practice, medical professionals in some cases became complicit in torture. Medical professionals who were present in CIA detention facilities could have raised concerns about torture. They could have refused to participate. They could have reported the torture to authorities, but in some cases, medical professionals remained silent or even actively participated in torture. Some physicians monitored detainees' vital signs during waterboarding to ensure they did not die. Some psychologists designed interrogation techniques. This involvement of medical professionals violated basic medical ethics and the Hippocratic Oath. After the detention program was disclosed, some medical professionals faced investigations by their state medical boards. Some lost their medical licenses, but not all medical professionals involved in the program faced consequences. This raises questions about accountability and about why some individuals face consequences while others do not. The role of the American Civil Liberties Union and other civil rights organizations in challenging the detention program through litigation is also worth noting. These organizations filed lawsuits challenging detention practices, seeking to force the government to disclose information about torture, and seeking to hold government officials accountable. These lawsuits faced significant obstacles, including government claims of national security immunity and judicial deference to executive branch decisions on national security matters. Despite these obstacles, civil rights organizations pursued litigation for many years. Eventually, some of this litigation resulted in disclosure of information about torture and in limitations on government power to detain and interrogate. While the litigation did not result in criminal prosecutions, it did play a role in bringing the detention program to public attention and in establishing legal constraints on government power. In conclusion, the story of the CIA's secret prisons in Afghanistan is a story about the corrosive effects of unchecked power and the abandonment of fundamental principles in the name of security. It is a story about an institution, the CIA, that was supposed to protect American security becoming an instrument of torture and human rights violations. It is a story about government officials at the highest levels authorizing torture and providing legal cover for torture. It is a story about how torture occurred on such a large scale and for so many years with minimal accountability. The CIA's detention program in Afghanistan resulted in the torture of thousands of people. Many were innocent, many were subjected to techniques widely recognized as torture, many suffered permanent physical and psychological injury, some died. The program violated international law. The program violated American values and constitutional principles. The program was ineffective at achieving its stated goals. The program made the world less stable and less safe, not more stable and safe. Yet despite all of this, those responsible for torture largely escaped accountability. No criminal prosecutions occurred. CIA officers continued their careers. Government officials who authorized torture continued in government service or moved to prestigious positions. The fundamental lesson has not been learned. Torture is wrong, torture is a crime, and those responsible for torture must be held accountable. The question going forward is whether America has learned from these dark years or whether the same mistakes could happen again. The question is whether torture will remain prohibited or whether it will be reconsidered under different circumstances. The question is whether the rule of law and respect for human rights will prevail or whether security concerns will once again override fundamental principles. The consequences of the CIA's detention program in Afghanistan extend far beyond Afghanistan. They have affected how the world views America. They have affected America's credibility as a defender of human rights and the rule of law. They have affected the lives of thousands of people who were tortured. They have affected the moral fabric of American institutions. These consequences will persist for years to come, a legacy of a dark chapter in American history that could have been prevented and that should never be repeated.